In the pre-Civil War South, the fabric of society was woven with threads of profound inequality and stark contrasts. Picture a world where 7% of the population owned nearly 3 million slaves, wielding immense power over the land, labor, and economy. This was not just an economic system, but a way of life that shaped the very soul of the South. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few created a society that was as luxurious and refined as it was brutal and exploitative. It was a world where the elite lived in opulent mansions, while the majority existed in poverty and despair. This is the story of the Southern planters, their rise, and their fall, a tale of grandeur, greed, and the bitter legacy they left behind. The Southern economy in 1860 was deeply rooted in agriculture, with the cultivation of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice at its core. The ownership of slaves was not just a means of production, but a symbol of status and power. The wealthiest planters owned vast tracts of land and hundreds of slaves, creating a feudal-like system where they ruled over their domains with near absolute authority. These planters were the aristocracy of the South, and their influence permeated every aspect of life. Yet this system was built on a foundation of profound injustice. The 5 million whites who owned no slaves were often left on the margins, economic outcasts with little hope of upward mobility. Among them, some found ways to align themselves with the slave-owning class, working as overseers, drivers, and dealers in slaves. Others struggled to make a living as merchants or skilled laborers, forming a small but growing middle class. The majority, however, were poor whites who faced a life of poverty and limited opportunities. The concentration of wealth and power was not just economic. It was also political. The planters dominated the political landscape, using their social prestige, property ownership, and the 3/5 compromise to maintain their grip on power. This compromise, which counted 3/5 of the slave population for representation in the legislature, gave the planters disproportionate influence. They used this power to control the distribution of seats in the legislature, ensuring that wealthy planters remained in control while the commercial class and poor whites were marginalized. The planters' influence extended to the legal system, where property qualifications for voting and holding office further entrenched their dominance. In many southern states, only landowners could vote for certain offices, and the requirements for holding office were often steep. For example, in South Carolina, the governor had to be worth £10,000, a sum that was out of reach for most people. This system of property qualifications ensured that political power remained in the hands of the wealthy few. The planters' control over the political system was so complete that it was often said that the political working of the state was in the hands of just 150 to 180 men. These men, drawn from the planter class, dictated the policies and laws that shaped the South. They fought bitterly to retain this power, even as the country moved toward greater democracy and industrialization. The planters saw any challenge to their authority as a threat to their way of life, and they were willing to go to great lengths to maintain their dominance. The social life of the planters was a world of luxury and refinement. They prided themselves on their education, though their understanding of modern conditions and trends was often limited. Many had attended prestigious universities like Princeton and Yale, where they cultivated a veneer of gentility and sophistication. They were skilled in the social graces, able to navigate the drawing rooms of European society with ease. Southern women of the planter class were trained in the arts of dependence, with a focus on French music and the latest European fashions. They were often described as beautiful and lived a life of leisure, managing large households with the help of numerous servants. Yet, behind this facade of refinement lay a darker reality. The planters' lifestyle was built on the exploitation of slave labor. They consumed extravagantly, spending money on elaborate households, fine food, and drink. Gambling, carousing, and dueling were common pastimes, and sexual lawlessness was a persistent feature of plantation life. The planters had access to harems of enslaved women, and the practice of concubinage was widespread. The census of 1860 recorded nearly 588,352 people of mixed race, a figure that likely underrepresented the true extent of sexual exploitation. The sexual chaos of the plantation system was a source of tension and hypocrisy. While the planters protected the virginity of a small class of white women, they subjected millions of enslaved women to sexual abuse and coercion. The children of these unions, often the unrecognized offspring of the planters, were sold or bequeathed as property. This sexual exploitation was not just a personal failing, but a systemic issue that was deeply embedded in the plantation economy. The planters' economic interests were focused on consumption rather than production. They sought to live grandly, often at the expense of sustainable farming practices. The pursuit of luxury and status led to widespread debt and financial instability, as many planters struggled to maintain their lavish lifestyles. Their lack of attention to financial details and the management of their plantations often resulted in the degradation of the land and the exploitation of their laborers. The planters' dominance began to wane in the years leading up to the Civil War. The rise of the poor whites and the growing abolitionist movement posed significant challenges to their authority. The Civil War itself dealt a devastating blow to the planter class, as their way of life was shattered by the emancipation of the slaves and the destruction of their economic base. The Reconstruction era that followed saw further attempts to dismantle the planters' power, but their legacy continued to shape Southern society in the decades that followed. The planters' influence persisted in the form of Jim Crow laws and the disenfranchisement of black citizens, as their political heirs sought to maintain their grip on power. The struggle for civil rights in the 20th century finally began to erode this legacy, but the echoes of the plantation system continue to resonate in the South today. In the end, the Southern planters left behind a complex and troubled legacy. Their world of grandeur and refinement was built on the backs of enslaved people, and their pursuit of luxury and status came at a great cost. The story of the planters is a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the moral consequences of a society built on inequality. The planters' world may be long gone, but its impact endures.